Hello, I am Marissa Cummings, and this is my talk, Safe Spaces for Raw Research for Magnify Conference 2021. So first, just to give you a little bit of background. This is a little bit about myself. So my background is in software development, design, and product management with a focus on user interface UI design. I am currently a research fellow and designer at the Glasgow School of Art with the Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre, also called DHI, and I care about inclusive, ethical design which empowers communities. And this on the right is a picture of me. So what's this talk about? So it focuses on my recent year-long Masters of Research project, which investigated the design of digital interfaces for health storytelling, working with participants who had multiple chronic health conditions, also called multimorbidity. The project emerged from previous work that DHI had done on patient perspectives and requirements for personal data stores, and this aligns with an area of healthcare practice called narrative medicine, which uses storytelling to promote care and personal well-being. So these are kind of the starting principles which emerged from the literature review that I did at the start of the project and also the previous research that had been done. And this is kind of what I was going into, which informed the design of the methodology. So first, people come first. As designers, we must adopt an empathetic and humanizing approach which prioritizes the needs of individuals over the group. Second, people should have ownership over their care, including their health stories, and be recognized as having lived experience, which gives them expertise. And third, stories can promote well-being, but they can also harm. So a story, for example, which doesn't resonate with someone's personal experience and is then being forced on them has the potential to do great harm to that person. Which kind of, again, underlines the importance of having ownership over their stories. So the literature review kind of dictates a narrative-led approach, but then the question I had was how to fit that in with a human-centered design process, which is a more standard process for digital design. And also, I then had the additional problem of figuring out how to fit myself into this process. So where do I fit in as the researcher and designer? So this was the kind of the problem and the question I had at the start of trying to work out the methodology. So you might be thinking at this stage, but we already use stories in human-centered design, so surely this is not that big of a problem. So yes, we do. So human-centered design already includes a number of tools for stories, such as, and I've listed here some, personas, storyboarding, empathetic design. So why not use these already existing approaches? So first, these tend to be simplified, generalized, and or fictionalized stories. So we take participant stories and then these are often broken down and used as kind of data chunks or sound bites within the project. And this fails to convey the complexity and impact of real experiences. Second, they tend to focus on positive journeys and outcomes, where negative experiences are treated as edge cases. And finally, they give the power to the designer as the participant is only involved in a limited way. And again, in all of this, it's important to remember that health stories can take place over a very long period of time. So again, the size of the story can be quite large and difficult to convey in something as kind of small as a persona. So this is not a new problem, and I've listed here some kind of references which also kind of discuss some of these issues. So Costanza Chalk, 2020, Design Justice. Jones, 2013, Design for Care. This is specifically about healthcare design, so useful for healthcare designers. And also Meyer and Wachter Botker, 2016, Design for Real Life. And I highly recommend this book in particular if you're looking for something which is on the same kind of theme as what I'm talking about, but maybe a little bit more light touch. So the problem isn't a new one, but how do we solve it? So how can we incorporate stories and participants in our research in a way that preserves emotional impact and participant ownership? Right, so this is kind of showing you the methodology that I used, and I'm going to kind of backtrack and explain this in a lot more detail, but this is just to kind of give you the starting point of what did I actually do. So I had 3 research stages which were repeated individually for each of my 5 participants. The first stage was health storytelling. So this was eliciting the participants' story using a semi-structured interview. And also then using that to develop visual concepts, then using those visual concepts to then inform a process of co-design. So I basically took the visual concepts that I created and broke these down into kind of engagement toolkits for each of the participants. So each participant had their own separate co-design toolkit, which we then used in a workshop to create visual representations of their story. Which I then kind of polished up a bit further and then used to create prototypes. And then in the final workshop, we kind of reflected on what had been created, and I did an additional semi-structured interview to talk about their experiences. And then this all together formed the research findings. And actually in this project, in this presentation, I'm not going to be going that much in depth on the actual research findings because this presentation is more focused on the methodological design, but I've included a link to the full thesis later on in the presentation, so if you're interested you can go and look that up and see more about what I learned from this. So the theoretical stance which I'm adopting here is hermeneutical phenomenology. So you might be thinking, oh, this is over-egging it a bit, but going into this project, it was really important to me to really ground my research theoretically. It's not something which we generally have a chance to do much of in industry. So I really wanted to take the time to really think about my theoretical stance and think about how all of these pieces were kind of fitting together and making sure that everything in the methodology was very consistent, rather than kind of the human-centered design approach which we normally use, which is kind of, just picking and choosing our tools as we go along to kind of glean findings to get the outcomes that we want. So a little bit about this theoretical stance. So this is kind of common stance used in phenomenological research, particularly, obviously phenomenological research, but particularly within narrative research. And this positioning allows us to understand that the researcher also exists within the research frame. So we are kind of abandoning any kind of ideas of false objectivity here. So first, it tells us that our understanding of the world is what allows us to understand the experiences of others. So therefore, all research is colored by the experiences and personal biases of the researcher. Second, research exists within a context. So we can understand findings as emerging from a particular place at a particular time with a particular group of people. It's representative of that context. So this is kind of, I guess, talking about this idea of working in dialogue. So using that theoretical stance, and I already showed you the methodology that I use is kind of cyclical working in stages. So this was derived from from sociologist Arthur Frank's idea of dialogical narrative analysis. So I use that to kind of form the basis of the methodology. So he says that first, the research is non-finalizable. No one, especially the researcher, ever has the whole story. The researcher talks with participants, not about them. And the researcher and the participants have mutual recognition. So in other words, there's an understanding that research exists within the context of people's lives and that we acknowledge that context. And the reference here is Frank, 2012, Letting Stories Breathe, a Socio-Narratology. So the primary method that I used was reflexive interviewing. So this is one-to-one interviews, either unstructured or semi-structured. They take place more than once. And again, we acknowledge the presence of the interviewer as a participant in this interview, which is carried out more in conversational terms. So this episodic approach is designed to build trust and create mutual understanding over time. Researchers and participants have periods of reflection in between, and these resting points can also be used by the researcher for further research. So again, this kind of cyclical idea. So the reference again here is Pessoa et al. 2019, using reflexive interviewing to foster deep understanding of research participants' perspectives. And then here, co-creation. So I've not really explained co-creation in much detail, as I'm assuming that most of us kind of have an idea of what this means. But this is more reflecting on the fact that co-creation processes are not inherently empowering. So attention still needs to be paid to explicit and ongoing consent from participants, the accessibility and safety of tools, and also the participant-researcher power dynamics. So we can't just put people in a room together and it just automatically participants are empowered. We need to think about how are they accessing things? Are they able to participate in the co-design process on a kind of equal level with the researcher? So references here, Sanders and Stapper's 2008, Co-Creation and the New Landscapes of Design, and Schweitzer 2017, What's in an Image Towards a Critical and Interdisciplinary Reading of Participatory Visual Methods. So this is kind of going more in depth on what I just discussed on kind of issues of accessibility and safety. So my project was carried out under COVID lockdown. So all of my engagements with participants had to be remote. So pros to this are that participants are in a safe space, which is already adjusted to be physically comfortable for them. In other words, they're home. There is no need for participants to travel, and it is easier to fit activities around existing commitments, and it's potentially a more inclusive approach as there is a lower barrier to entry. So for example, I had participants talk to me while their children were being cared for in the other room. I had one participant that I interviewed while she was like tucked up under a blanket on her sofa. So it's creating a much higher level of physical comfort than we could possibly achieve in like a workspace, for example. The cons is that it's harder to get hands-on engagement without tactile elements. And also, technical tools need to be carefully considered for security and participant capabilities, so as not to be excluding. So this is further expanding on the consent, which I talked about earlier in co-creation. So the process I use is called dynamic consent. So dynamic consent is explicit, it's specific, and it's ongoing. So this project included 2 formal checkpoints with signed consent forms at the start and the middle of the project, and also 3 informal checkpoints, one after each research stage, to review what had been produced and consent to its inclusion in the project. So in other words, after each engagement, I would go away, I would do analysis on what we had done and pull together kind of all of the stuff that we had produced. All of that would then be sent over to the research participant for them to review. So they would have the opportunity to look over everything that we had produced and kind of individually say, oh, you know, I'm okay with this being included. I don't want that to be included, what have you. So this gives them a great deal of kind of comfort and safety, and that they know they can say or do anything within that kind of engagement, and that it won't necessarily be included in the project. They have space to go away and reflect and then later think, oh, I didn't actually want that included. So the reference here is Bustamante Duarte et al. 2019, Safe Spaces in Participatory Design with Young Forced Migrants. And this project uses this type of consent, so this is a good model if you're interested in learning more about this. And then where do we sit within this process? How do we care for ourselves and participants during emotional research? So, ethnographer Carolyn Ellis argues that maintaining an objective distance from participants during highly emotional research is unethical and can cause participants greater harm. And I like this quote from Finley to kind of illustrate this. Research does not involve a participant subject talking/telling to a passive and distant researcher. Instead, what is revealed emerges out of a constantly evolving, negotiated, dynamic, co-created relational process to which both researcher and participant co-researcher contribute. So this is, again, we're getting into this idea of a relationship being formed between the researcher and the participant, and that this is actually part of the research. So my references here are Ellis, 2004, The Ethnographic Eye, a methodological novel about autoethnography, a great resource for doing emotional research, and also just an entertaining read. And Finley, 2009, Ambiguous Encounters, a relational approach to phenomenological research. And then this kind of sums it up, this quote. So this is talking about a stance of friendship in research. So she says, for a mutual, close, and or lasting friendship to develop between every researcher and all participants is unrealistic. Regardless, we can approach respondents from a stance of friendship, meaning we treat them with respect, honor their stories, and try to use their stories for humane and just purposes. And this is from Tillman Healy, 2003, Friendship as Method. So I think this really just sums up kind of what I think the stance should be of a researcher in this type of research process. We're not necessarily expecting participants to be friends with us, but we're treating them as if they are our friends, with the same level of kind of respect and consideration that we would give to our friends. And then also, I think really importantly is the necessity of including researcher processing and self-care into this process. So I've included some things I've done, and hopefully these will help you. So first could be mindfully reflecting on the session, the person you are working with, using a stance of friendship and humility, being aware of one's attitude, using structured or semi-structured journaling to record notes on the session and personal reflections, and also within ethical boundaries, processing emotions and doing supportive self-care activities with other researchers or friends and family. So again, this preserving participant anonymity and whatever else you may need to do to preserve the ethics of your project, but still taking time to kind of process and reflect on what you've learned with other people if you can. So references here, Malacrida, 2007, Reflexive Journaling on Emotional Research Topics, Ethical Issues for Team Researchers. And also Yeager and Barrow, 2013, Cultural Humility, Essential Foundation for Clinical Researchers. So I'm going to go over here one of my participants' stories, and this is just to give you an idea of how basically their story was translated in the kind of the process, the research process end to end, and what that actually looks like. So this is my participant Ted Head. This is obviously a pseudonym. All my participants here are identified with pseudonyms, and this is the pseudonym he selected. So Ted Head is a 53-year-old man. He was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis, also called ME, sometimes referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, and chronic depression, as well as irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Before becoming ill, Ted had worked as a medical engineer. He loved to sail, but had to sell his boat after he became too unwell to use it. And this is kind of a quote from his initial interview. He talked a lot about hope and the necessity of hope. And one of the things he talked about was this song, Mary Ellen Carter, which is a song about a boat. He loves boats, so he said, I've known the song Mary Ellen Carter for a long time. Biographically, the ship in the song represents your life. That's what the singer is intending, that it represents your life and the battles in your life. But the thing about that song is that it offers hope. There's hope that the ship can be rescued and returned to service, that you can go and return to your normal life. Unfortunately, in ME, there is no such hope. You have to live with the constraints that you now find yourself in because there isn't even a treatment, let alone a cure. But that, for me, is too negative. I have to live with some hope, and that song is the song of hope. So after the initial kind of interview with him, this is a screenshot of some of the um, visual kind of representations I did for the co-creation workshop. So this is kind of from the co-creation workshop, some of the kind of rough stuff that we came up with. And apologies, this is a little blurry, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what the process was looking like at that stage. And then this was actually what we produced at the end after co-creating and then engagements. Then this is actually what came out of it. So this is this idea of a kind of ship's log representation of a house story. We have a hope flower on the side, which Ted had talked about the need to kind of nurture hope and care for it. So we have it represented as a plant. He also did a great deal of research himself about his condition. So he wanted a place to store that research, so we had an idea of research rutters based on the idea of a ship's rudder, where he could kind of store research that he had done. So this is showing a screenshot of the kind of landing page with the kind of overall log with different entries. This is a screenshot of an individual entry, so an idea of it for an individual entry layout. And then this is kind of what a research rutter might look like, with kind of different links and resources kind of in there that he could kind of manage those. And of course, as Arthur Frank says, the stories are never non-finalized. They're non-finalizable, so they continue. So since the project finished, I've kept in touch with Ted Head. His health has significantly improved after undergoing a treatment procedure last year. He actually recently bought a new boat, and he sent me a picture of himself sailing, which was lovely. And all of the kind of the full stories can be found in my thesis, which is this link. So it's radar.gsa.ac.uk/7525. So you can go there to find out more. And so what did I learn from all of this? So this is kind of what participants thought about it. They really enjoyed the process. Overall, the feedback I got was very positive. They were very invested, and they enjoyed seeing how their stories evolved. And at the end, each participant got a personalized booklet with their story. So this is a quote from my participant Sharon talking about what she thought about it. She said, "I'm quite amazed at what you've been able to achieve from just a couple of chats between us. It's difficult to think back now to the first meeting, which was the most intense one, I think. It was trying to find a way to relate my story to you. But I do remember at the time thinking even having done that was a useful process to go through. It's a long time since I've done that, if ever." So even getting the chance to kind of share their stories with me was actually really important to them. So closing thoughts about all of this. So the initial challenge I had was to incorporate an emotional narrative research process into a human-centered digital approach. So I achieved this by giving participants a safe private space to share their stories with me, ensuring that they retained ongoing ownership of their stories through a dialogical research process using dynamic consent, approaching participants from a stance of friendship and respect, and also giving participants control over the direction of the work and final validation of the work. So I wanted to kind of touch on the emotional impact of doing this. So doing this type of deep, sustained reflection with participants gave really deep emotional insights, as I hope you kind of saw from that the short quote that I included from Ted Head's interview. And it's difficult to imagine participants sharing that type of information in a group setting. Undertaking a project of this type really had a huge impact on myself as a researcher. To listen to someone's health story is to hear about some of the most difficult times in someone's life. And it wasn't uncommon for participants to start crying while they were telling me their stories. So it's quite difficult and emotional for me to listen to. And these stories, the themes of hope and despair, go straight to the heart, I think, of what it means to be human. And I feel, and I hope you feel, that the final outputs resonate with kind of these stories. So that is the conclusion of my talk. So if you are interested in following up, I've included here my email address, which is m.cummings@gsa.ac.uk. And you can also find me on Twitter at mcc_Cummings. Thank you very much.